Here we go, kids, trying to look at quote unquote the rest of the world. We're actually not looking much at the Americas in this case for no particular reason except that it just makes sense for me to kind of stay in that Afro-Eurasia range. And to be fair, you're going to notice it's a lot more on Asia. We're talking between the world wars, between World War I, World War II. Needless to say, there's a ton we could say about the different peoples, the individuals, the groups, the independence movements, all these things in Africa. It's probably less of a period of change, though, than you'll see in Asia, per se. And again, the Americas kind of keeping separate a little bit for no reason other than that's how I organize it. Starting with the Middle East, also called Southwest Asia. Obviously, if you think about it, well, what's middle and what's east about it? Well, from the perspective of Europeans, it's not the far east like China, it's the Middle East. Southeast Asia seems to be a better term as far as I'm concerned. Also interesting, we talk about the Middle East, it's always a little bit unclear what exactly it refers to. I mean, it could politically, culturally, historically include Pakistan, Afghanistan, if you wanted it to. It certainly does in the modern day political world include Egypt and some other countries in North Africa. So it's a sort of vague term. Before we get into this, let me recommend a 1,400-page book. I know. Look, it's so fabulous, I've read it twice cover to cover, and it is like 1,300 pages long. Written by Robert Fisk, a magnificent independent journalist who sadly died in this last year. I was generally heartbroken by this. But if you want to get a really and true understanding of the last 100 years in the modern Middle East, which, let's face it, this is, if there is a place that you can count on consistently appearing in the headlines of every news site imaginable, it generally is this area. Everything from Iraq to Iran to Israel, Palestine, to Syria, to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia. Just think for a moment how often you see these countries as headline newses in some way. Robert Fisk is a journalist that spent he spent the last 45 years of his life living in Lebanon, traveling to every single place. And once we get to the more modern Middle East, i.e. during my lifetime, you're going to find that Robert Fisk was on the ground for each one of these major events and conflicts till the time of his death. So, recommended book. I'm not saying that I have an e-copy that I could send you. Actually, I am going to say that because he had this placed as public domain. It's a book he wanted people to read. So, you're just thinking this summer, man, I would really like to understand the Middle East in an incredibly readable, engaging, passionate way. This is the book for you. Let me know. So you'll recall, going back in history, most of what we call the Middle East, it's largely Arab, but not entirely. Iranians are not Arabs, largely under control of the Ottoman Empire. Now, if we're going back to the 16th, 17th century, it's definite control. It's the powerful Ottoman Empire. By the 18th, certainly late 19th century, early 20th century, the name Ottoman Empire might appear on maps, but relatively little control. And the Arab people that had lived under the Ottomans for many years were never totally comfortable with it. They were wanting to move on. So you see, as World War I breaks out, it's in August of 1914. You see a letter written by, and I'm not remembering the name of the guy, but it's a British ambassador who is McMahon, that was his name, the McMahon letter, written to the Sharif of Mecca. Who is the Sharif? Well, he is the established political / military / religious leader of the people of Mecca, of the Arab population. Remember, in the world of Islam, that separation between political leader and religious leader, it's often pretty blurry by design. If you take a look through this, what you are bottom line seeing is the British saying, look, there are a couple of areas, especially in what we call Syria today, that, we wouldn't say. This has a different history. But bottom line, the British folks, we British Empire, are very, very interested and supportive of the idea of an independent Arab homeland. It can be up to you. It can be many different states, can be one big one, but you got to do something for us. Help us out. Help fight against the Ottomans. They are the allies of the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and that would help us out a lot. And afterwards, the independence you've wanted for so long could be yours. Here's the problem. October 1915, sounds good. A lot of Arab the leaders, it's called the Arab Revolt. They revolt against the Ottomans, create great problem for the Ottomans. But the problem is this. About 6 months later, the French and the British, the main allies in Europe, say, look, we can't really turn all this territory over to Arabs. I mean, after all, who are these people? They're not civilized like us. They're not sophisticated. And although they didn't want to say it publicly, this was actually a secret agreement, but even between them, they were pretty hesitant about this because although it's only just being discovered, it is understood this is an oil central area of the world, and that's becoming increasingly important. The bottom line is that it's not as if the British and French are going to take over and colonize, but you'll see from the map, this will be the area that we will influence, watch over, protect. They are called mandates, not colonies, but mandates. Now, how long do the British and French plan to be there? Is it for a few years, a few decades, a few centuries? Well, that's not really said. And I've got to say that if you are an Arab independence leader who believed the promises the British gave you, who decided that you're going to stand up and rise up against the British forces, against the Ottoman forces, you don't have a lot of faith that the British and French are only there for a couple of years to help the transition. You feel like you've been betrayed. And by the way, modern days, you talk about the Osama bin Ladens of the world who talk about the historic mistreatment of the Muslim people of the world by the West. They talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is very relevant to the modern. So here is our modern Middle East. It looks about like this today. There actually are two Sudans, as you probably know. Hey, Sudan, is that a part of the Middle East? Well, in the northern part, it's predominantly Muslim. It is Arab. I suppose you could consider it part of that. But again, it's a pretty tricky to draw line exactly. Where does the so-called Middle East actually end politically, culturally, etc.? Turkey is worth taking a look at. Remember, it was the so-called sixth man of Europe. The Ottomans had been losing more and more territory. At one point, they controlled all of North Africa and all of what we call the Middle East, and they extended into southeastern Europe, into the Balkans. Little by little, that had been falling apart over the past couple of centuries. The Western European countries develop in ways that the Turks simply don't. Kind of in a desperate way, the Turks sign up on the German side, part of the Central Powers during World War I, for no other reason really than they need to pick a side, they need a big victory, and they choose the losing side. So the war is over. What's going to happen with this territory? The Turk reformers, the so-called young Turks, who have been kind of the children of the Tanzimat changes, that the movement that we had seen maybe 40 or 50 years earlier, present themselves to the world as a new type of Turk. We are more than willing to break with our Ottoman past. We want to be a modern, secular state. Allow us to be Turkey, to be the new Republic of Turkey, and we will happily get rid of all the areas we had taken on over the years. Turkey is founded in 1923. A man named Mustafa Kemal, who becomes known as Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk is his known name today, means father of the Turks, becomes the president of that new republic. Won't go into great details about this, but Ataturk sees himself, you know what, probably looking at what the Japanese did. The Japanese adopted what was working in the West in order to become a great state yet again. So reforming the old ways, republicanism, an elected form of government, secular, and this is probably to this day the most controversial. Ataturk was, I believe he would have been a religious person to a degree. I think he probably would have considered himself a Muslim. He absolutely believed that religious-run states are ineffective, and he moves toward a very secular form of Islam. The prayer calls are now given in Turkey in Turkish, not in Arabic. The Quran is translated into other languages, Turkish most particularly, and that was not done for a long time. You say, well, that's weird. How in the world could Muslims want the Quran only to be in Arabic, since many people don't speak Arabic? You go back a couple hundred years, that was the case with the Bible as well. The Bible could only be in Latin, and we'll tell you what it means. Well, that carries on still today in many parts of the Muslim world. Nationalism. We aren't part of the Ottoman Empire. We are Turks. We are the Turkish nationality. Populism, a little bit hard to describe, but there's a personal leadership to Ataturk. To this day, his photograph is in every possible classroom that you'll see in Turkish schools, etc. So there's a personal leadership. And a Tatism, capitalism, state-guided, however. And you're going to see something similar to this in China and other. Iraq, which of course very much in the news the last 20 years or so. There was never such a thing as Iraq. What we had was three separate parts of the Ottoman Empire, incredibly diverse. We had Shias, we had Sunnis, there were Christians. At that point, there was a Jewish population. Most of that is now gone, of course, moved on to other places. By the way, the Christians, when I was growing up in the Detroit, Michigan area, at my high school, we had about a 10% Arab population. Most of them were Chaldeans. They were Christian Arabs, and in fact, I have learned since, nearly all their families came from a very small, specific region within Iraq. So I have my own history of that as well. You have ethnic groups, in particular the Kurds, who are spread out in Syria, the southern part of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, etc. These are a people, they've had a really rough past. They feel betrayed by others. They want their own area called Kurdistan. That is their goal. To this date, as of 2021, it has not happened. Remember, this area had been controlled by the Ottomans, but the mandate system, it becomes British. There is a massive rebellion on the ground, hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla warfare, very similar to what the United States met when the United States showed up in 2003. And again, British oil. The British control it, becomes a huge oil state. By the way, you might notice that down toward the south, you see a little in green here called Kuwait. Kuwait was absolutely made up by the British, largely to put a separate king in charge there that was very friendly to the British. In other words, we have a British-friendly state on the Persian Gulf, which allows oil to be exported. Wait till we get to the 1990s. You're going to see how that clicks in and how that becomes pretty important. Again, it seems to me World War I and the post-World War I period, so much of what happens in the world today has its starting point here. Saudi Arabia, you might notice from that earlier map, is the one that is not divided up between the European powers, between France and England. And a big part of this was symbolically. It's pretty important. It's Mecca and Medina. It's the holy land of the Islamic empires, or of Muslim people in general. And that was thought to be a way to satisfy the Arabs. Well, you're not really getting the independence we promised, but you are in charge of your holy, holy cities. Also, taking a look at what we call today Saudi Arabia, it's basically a coastline and a bunch of sand in the middle. It's almost entirely desert. What's the point? In 1933, the world's largest oil supplies are found there. Let me tell you why this is so important. The British recognized Ibn Saud. Ibn, by the way, means son, so it's called the House of Saud. Saud is the family. There were a lot of Bedouin, of nomadic, sort of tribes people. The British selected him. What becomes so important about him? He's a Wahhabi. Do you remember Ibn Wahhab from the 18th century? He was the reformer who said the world of Islam has fallen behind because we've abandoned the way of Islam. We need a strict, orthodox, fundamentalist version where it's in the Quran. That's what we do, and we are essentially at war with people who are not willing to follow that very, very strict version. Well, at some point, it doesn't matter that a local king or a local chief, you might even call him, is a Wahhabi. It does matter when his family is given control over Saudi Arabia, because they control the Hajj, they control Mecca and Medina, they control the millions, tens of millions of people traveling there every year, and once you add the oil money that starts pouring into Saudi Arabia starting in the 30s and certainly by the 60s, 70s, the Saudis use that incredible wealth to fund across Asia and across the world their own extraordinarily strict version of Islam. Where did 17 of the 21 hitchhikers come on 9/11? Hijackers come on 9/11? Saudi Arabia. Where did Osama bin Laden come from? Saudi Arabia. The largest mosques throughout Pakistan, throughout Indonesia, they're Saudi funded and with often very, very, very strict Islamic teachings as a part of them. So again, part of today's story. Here it is, World War I. And then probably the most controversial of them, Palestine. Palestine it's an Arabic land. It's mostly Arabic-speaking people. It is also its own sort of independent area. People that have lived here, it's a small area, not heavily populated, but goes back about 1,200 years, had always been under outside control, had been under the Greeks, had been under the Persians, certainly under the Ottoman Empire, etc. Well, here's the question. What does England and France do after World War I? Well, they start initially by dividing into one giant mandate, one giant thing called Transjordan, which includes Palestine. And then in 1922, it separated out more. You see the quote here, and I always wish I had written down who said this, but it sums it up well. A small land in Arab hands for 1,200 years that was suddenly promised to Eastern European Jews. And this is interesting. You need to know the term Zionism. Zionism means the creation of a Jewish state, specifically, eventually in Palestine, i.e., the Holy Land, the land that was supposedly promised to Abraham and to Moses many thousand years ago. Interestingly, initially, the early Zionists in Europe were not particularly religious people. I mean, yes, there's this religious background or history, but bottom line, we need a state for Jewish people. Look, the reality is long before Hitler and the Holocaust, being Jewish in Europe was brutal. They had been pushed out of many countries. There are a series of what we call pogroms. Those are massacres. Those are tens of thousands of Jewish people being massacred by mobs, often with the support or participation of the state. Why are there so many Jews in Eastern Europe? Because Western Europe had pushed Jewish people out over the centuries. Spain in the 1400s, and France in the 1300s, and the British in the 1200s. So they all moved toward the eastern part of Europe in what today is Poland or Russia or Romania, etc. So there is a definite move. We need a homeland. We need a place where we can be safe. Now, eventually, the Zionist leaders do settle upon Palestine, i.e. the traditional Holy Land of Jewish people, but it didn't need to be that way. There was a move initially to make it, I believe it was in East Africa, in what today is Uganda. The thinking was, well, it's uninhabited, there's no one there. Of course, there were Ugandan people there. There were African people there. But from the European mindset of the 19th century, African people is essentially no people. A key move during World War I. The British government releases what is known as the Balfour Declaration. And let me read this to you. His Majesty's government, notice this is during the war, by the way, late in the war, mid to late to the war. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other countries. Bottom line, Great Britain, who is about to become the dominant imperial power in the Middle East once the Ottomans are defeated, are calling for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now you see these lines. It will not damage the rights of the non-Jewish communities, the Arabs, the Arab Christians, the Arab Muslims. It's not really what happens, though. Why? Look, there is a concern for Jewish people. Absolutely. For all the violence against Jews, they're a long time. It's a very, very sympathetic population. Also, the British are pretty interested in having a foothold in the Middle East. It's apparent by 1917 that, we're probably eventually going to win this war. The Ottomans will leave. We've already met with the French and agreed to divide up this territory. Well, if there is a Jewish state that we, the British, can be seen as having implemented, led by Eastern European Jews for the most part, who are Europeans like us, who are white or white-ish, this is a people we'll be able to deal with, we'll have a relationship with in, after all, what's going to be a pretty important part of the world. You start seeing, by the way, it's called the Aliyah to Jewish people in Hebrew, and it's a movement back to the Holy Land. It begins in the 1880s, and let me tell you, with the Balfour Declaration, where the British government says we support a Jewish state, we begin to see a large number of Jewish people, mainly from Eastern Europe, moving in today what we call Israel or Palestine or both. Again, you look at these numbers back in the 1850s. Now, there's a belief in some Zionist headquarters, it was a completely empty land that we came into, and that's not true. We are seeing, back in the 1850s, about 300,000 people living in a pretty small part of Palestine. Palestine is not huge geographically. And you see those numbers grow, and very, very few Jews there. Yes, it had been a Jewish homeland some, 3,000 years earlier, but certainly was not. Remember I mentioned in the 1880s, you start seeing a calculated Zionist movement to move Jewish people back to the Holy Land, and you'll notice the population doubles. Well, here we are by the year 1919. This is at the end of World War I. And, 87% of the population is Arab, 13% is Jewish. But notice, after the Balfour Declaration, you do see the Arab population growing, but you start to see the Jewish population grow substantially. And then, of course, as being Jewish in Europe, particularly in Hitler's world, becomes incredibly dangerous, you see a large number of Jews starting to move. This has created, of course, a lot of conflict. Historically, Jewish and Arab people, they've gotten along pretty well. In the Ottoman Empire, it was possible to sort of live in relative, tolerance with others, have certain rights just simply as a citizen. That begins to change a lot as the Arab population of this land, quite understandably, see themselves being threatened by a Jewish population coming in. In 1948, it becomes the state of Israel, which is recognized by the rest of the world, and a lot of conflict. We'll get to that by the end of it. Africa between the wars, again, not saying a ton about this because I think big picture, well, part of it's my own ignorance. I'll be honest about that. I don't know a lot about Africa in the early 20th century. The fact that we are talking about a little tiny chunk of land as Israel, Palestine, and then we're dismissing this huge continent as Africa tells you that your teacher, like, I'll be honest, most history teachers, especially Western history teachers, we just don't know a ton about this. It's something I'm working on, but I'm not there yet. Also, though, I think you can argue that the status of most of these African peoples between the wars doesn't change that dramatically. Now, after World War II, it does, and we're going to start teasing out the different cultures and new states to be sure. But there are some changes that happened during and after the war, and a big part of it is a lot of African men go to Europe and they fight. And they see something different. The French have some 700,000 African soldiers fighting for them. What happens? Those who go become familiar with a different world. They begin to recognize, simply because you're cut off from the world or you don't have the same type of schooling doesn't mean that you're inherently less intelligent. And a lot of these African men will go there. They'll hear about the liberty, equality, and fraternity of France, or all men are created equal. And then they'll look at how they've been living in Africa colonized by outsiders. So you tend to see the beginnings of wait a minute, why are we somebody else's whipping boy? Why is it that Europeans are controlling us for their own benefit? Some of these people that go over to Europe, some of them stay on, they attend universities, they come back to be leaders, and the big imperial powers, look, the British and French win World War I, but it is a victory that leaves them both significantly weakened for loss of life and health concerns and debt and all these other types of things. So the writing starts to be on the wall. I suspect there were people in the 1920s that said, you know what, Europe's time dominating Africa, it's coming to an end. It might be a decade or two or three, but it's coming. It took more than this. Asia was definitely more on the cusp at this point, but it starts to happen in Africa. Moving back to Asia, really very, very, very quickly with Egypt, which again, it's really politically a part of the Middle East, but it's also North Africa. Recall I had said that it was nominally controlled by the Ottomans. The Ottomans got to send an official to sit on the throne and, eat expensive food, but it really was under British control by the 1880s. And the key is this: the Suez Canal, finished around 1870, allows Europeans, and particularly the British, to not go around Africa to get to their Indian colony, but to simply go through the Mediterranean Sea, through this landscape here, through the Red Sea, the south of Saudi. I think it cuts the trip to India by like 60% or something like that. Not too much more to say about Egypt at this point. We will after World War II. Oh no, I forgot I had wanted to mention this because this is important in the modern day. An Egyptian named Hassan al-Banna found what he calls the Muslim Brotherhood. And you look at the language: Allah or God is our goal, the Prophet Muhammad is our leader, the Quran is our law, holy war, watch the translation, it's actually jihad, like struggling for the greatest, to be the best Muslims we can. To die for Allah is our highest expectation. It's dramatic language, and it doesn't really sum up most Muslims, most Arabs by any means, but there's an idea of I guess you'd say a Muslim nationalism. I don't know how else to put it. The recognition that I think you see from a lot of Muslim reformers that the Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, was supposed to be dominant across the world. And if you go back a few hundred years with the Mughal Empire at its height and the Safavid Empire at its height and the Ottoman rising to new heights, and you see areas in Asia from Indonesia and Malaysia that are largely Muslim, it looks like we could have a Muslim-dominated world, which, after all, that is the one and true message of God. Why would it not be? I think it's pretty hard to be a political or religious leader in the Muslim world after World War I and think things are going pretty good in the Muslim world. Now, some are suggesting, like Kemal Ataturk, look, Islam has held us back. We're Muslims. Great. Let's move on with it and be a modern state. You might see the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia who are calling for a return to the ways of the 7th century. What you see from the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is still an active group today, and it has chapters in many, many countries across the world, is a combination. We believe in a fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. No doubt about it. What would the Prophet do? That's our answer. But, let's utilize the modern technologies of the Western world. In other words, let's look at the Quran, the Holy Book, and the Hadith, which is a collection of sayings by and about the Prophet Muhammad, who, recall, is not a god, he's not supernatural, but he's that ideal human being. Let's look at these texts again. There are maybe things that are strictly forbidden by Islam, and we're not going to touch that. But are there things that may be out of habit we've interpreted in ways that have held us back? Also, one of the reasons the Muslim Brotherhood has grown and become so popular, major emphasis: social services, economic justice. One of the things, Osama bin Laden, who is not part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but affiliated, his group was affiliated in some ways. Bin Laden said one of the things that drove him crazy was the fact that Saudi princes lived like the billionaires they were, while hundreds of millions of Muslims lived in desperate poverty. This is something he saw as fundamentally wrong. I think I've made the argument before that of the major world faiths, you could perhaps call Islam the most economically equal. In theory, it was wrong to have too much money. After all, by law, you don't just give to charity. By law, zakat, you give 2.5% of your wealth every year to the poor. Do all Muslims in the world do that? They do not. There are, do all Bolivians pay all of their taxes every year? No, they don't. So it's not as if it happens that way, but there is that principle of equality, of economic justice, not just religious justice, that is pretty fundamental to the core of Islam. Let's move on quickly to India. It's going to be probably not going to, it's probably going to take an hour to get through this all together. We have India, Japan, and China to look at still. One of the most recognizable figures in the world. I don't think there are too many people that would look at this picture and say, who's that? Of course, Mohandas Gandhi. Recall that the British had formally taken over India by 1857. I believe that is the year 1857, 1858. This creates, of course, India has a proud history, a long, sophisticated history. What we end up seeing is in 1885, an organization is founded called the Indian National Congress. It is not, very important, not an independence movement. In fact, the first two presidents of the Congress were British. But what they were arguing is that, look, India we really shouldn't be servants, the British. We're part of the British Empire, but India is a proud and sophisticated culture, needs to have more rights, more control over their destiny. That's what the Indians deserve, and it will, they argued, work better for the British as well, not to be as dominant. The goal was to be an all-India Congress. However, we know that India is very divided religiously between a Muslim population, maybe about a quarter of the population at this time, and a Hindu population, about 3/4. And again, what you're going to see is that there are some tensions in that. Even Muslims and Hindus who get along pretty well with one another, concerned about who holds the power. And for that reason, in 1906, another group was found called the Indian Muslim League. Now, like the Congress, they were not calling for independence. They were loyal to the Brits. We are part of the British Empire. We're proud of this, etc. And not calling for a separate Islamic India, but protection of Muslim interests. I mean, you can see how if 3/4 of the population is Hindu, that would mean less political power, less economic power. Incidentally, almost all, to my knowledge, of the early founders of the Muslim League, they were also members of the Indian National Congress. They didn't see themselves as in competition. Yes, we believe in more rights for Indian peoples, and as maybe my afternoon job or my second job, working to make sure that Muslim Indians are well represented and well treated. Yeah, 75% Hindu, that sounds about right. You see some of the numbers here that show that the Hindus were, they were economically advantaged, they were politically advantaged, etc. Although Hindus and Muslims both participated in that revolt in 1857, the British saw the Muslims, concerned about the pig fat, at least in theory, in the rifles, as being the most rebellious. So the British were doing their best to kind of keep the clamps on particularly Muslim nationalist Indians. The Germans had great hopes. They thought that if they went to Indian leaders and they said, look, if you folks rebel against the British, we'll help get rid of the British. You can move toward independence. You can do this. The Germans did the same thing in Ireland somewhat more effectively. So it's not that the Germans were particularly interested in Indian independence. I suspect they couldn't really care less, but your enemy's enemy is your friend. The British were terrified about this. I mean, first of all, the Germans, if they could lead a major revolt, we're talking hundreds of millions of people revolting when almost all the British resources are needed in Europe. Remember how dependent, of course, the British economy was upon India, upon the cotton, upon the food, upon the wealth that is created, etc. In reality, though, Indians almost all remain loyal to British, particularly the leaders. You have a couple 100,000 Indian troops who are volunteering. You might remember that bit that I read you about the bombardment of the Somme, where you could see the Indian cavalrymen with their dark faces lit by the cigarettes they're smoking. So you do actually see large number of Indian troops almost immediately. And number I have here, not sure I got, is about 1.5 million soldiers. Beyond that, though, it's the labor, the resources, the financial help, the taxes, etc., etc., etc. Officially, the two leading groups of Indian nationalism, Congress and the League, they support the war effort. And you can ask yourself, why? Why would Indians who've been colonized by outsiders support them? Well, first of all, battle, joining the military, honor, money, loyalty, etc. And there was also a sense, a little bit like W.E.B. Du Bois saying, I'm going to encourage African Americans to support the U.S. war effort. Well, a belief that if we Indians show our loyalty, the British are going to treat us better. They're going to recognize how much we stood up for the empire, and we think it can work for us. Now, you might say, of course, Gandhi would never have supported a war because he was a pacifist. Well, look at what Gandhi had to say during the time of the war. It's our job to fight and support our British Empire. We are British citizens. Gandhi, there's some changes by the time he becomes an internationally known figure. I think you'll find, though, with many of these characters, Gandhi, on one hand, did come to believe in complete nonviolence for moral reasons, but also for political reasons. Thought it would be more effective as well. But interesting, a lot of people are surprised. Gandhi did not fight in World War I, but he did serve to drive an ambulance and so forth. So he was a part of the war effort without ever picking up a weapon. This is key. Look, let's say that in this class, you wanted to see some changes. You wanted to see higher grades and less homework. Now, you happen to know that Dr. Gilway, or if these are students in future years listening to this, another director at another school, you know that she has threatened me with firing and there's a parents' revolt to get rid of me. And I'm on very, very thin ice. Let me tell you, wouldn't that be a really good time for you guys to rise up and demand changes from me? Because I gotta say, if you were to start complaining about me, I'm vulnerable right now. I need the support of the students. Wouldn't that be a good time for you guys to come and say, hey, look, Seeger, we're wanting to see higher grades and less homework. By the way, we know that you need our support. Isn't there a good likelihood that I might respond to this? Well, you see a meeting of the Indian National Congress and Muslim League. Again, many people were members of both at this point. Muslim leaders are members of both. They issue a set of demands in 1916. Notice it's during the war. The British cannot make enemies of Indians at this point. They don't want independence, but they want to see more power for the Indian legislature. The viceroy, which is the governor, we want Indians as a part of this. The Muslim League, which is watching out for Muslim interests, is able to negotiate with the Congress to call for separate elections and electorates in some Muslim areas. This is not something that Congress wanted to see, but in order to get unity, they were willing to do this. So what you see are some attempt, when the British are vulnerable, an attempt to push the envelope a little bit and force the British to try to recognize some changes. I'll tell you, if the war hadn't been going on, the British government would have denounced this. They would have said, absolutely not, we're not listening, because they needed British support, they needed Indian support. British government's response, well, this is interesting. We will certainly consider all of this, etc., etc. And yes, this is really the first time that we see a recognition that Muslim and Hindu India, that there is some separation in that final thing. You might recognize two of these people. One of them in particular. Who is that up top? That is Mohandas Gandhi. Yes, Gandhi had hair at one point, just like me. You can sort of recognize him, but yeah, he's Western dressed. He was a lawyer, studied in the UK, went off to South Africa, etc. And Motilal Nehru, who is the father of the gentleman you see at the bottom, Jawaharlal Nehru, who becomes the first president, first prime minister, I forget which, of India following independence. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah, another important character, member of the Muslim League and Congress. He is the guy who becomes the leader of the Muslim League, and toward the onset and end of World War II begins demanding a separate Muslim India, which becomes known as Pakistan. So he is the leader. He is not himself a deeply religious man. He's a man that believes, that eventually comes to believe, that politically, economically, the Muslim minority will never be able to prosper in an India that is dominated by Hindus. Gandhi at one point said, Mr. Jinnah, I give you my assurance that you will be treated as fellow Indians. And Jinnah said, Mr. Gandhi, if every Hindu in India were you, I wouldn't worry about it. That's not real world. So I mentioned, and this is so important. This is really like the inevitable Indian independence comes from this act. So you'll recall that most Indians support the war effort. And while the war is going on, there are some pretty strict restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It's not something that I think everybody necessarily supported, but people understood this. There's at least a sense of, look, the entire British Empire is at war. This is a time where at least you can argue that governments should limit political speech and what's published. Okay, we understand this. The British win the war in 1918. Indians were a huge part of that battle. But then in 1919, the so-called Rowlatt Act of the British Parliament takes the wartime censorship and the ability to arrest Indian people without trial, and they say it's going to continue after the war is over. Again, many Indians were not comfortable with these limitations, but could at least say the empire is at war, this is temporary. But the war is over, folks, and yet the British government continues to censor and persecute Indian nationalists. It becomes clear this no longer has anything to do with winning a war. It has to do with keeping the independence movement down. You see Muhammad Ali Jinnah, again, the eventual founder of Pakistan, leader of the Muslim League. Bottom line, a government that passes sanctions such as a law like this in times of peace forfeits its claim to be called a civilized government. These are strong words. And there are protests throughout India. And in particular, in April of 1913, at a place called Jallianwala Bagh. Bagh is just a park, more or less. In a place called Amritsar. Amritsar is the holy city of the Sikh people, who we've talked a little bit about. There are, thousands or so unarmed, peacefully protesting, mostly Sikh leaders. And there are thousands of people around, and they're protesting these Rowlatt Acts. And the British government comes in, led by a General Dyer, come in with their tanks, their machine guns. They line up outside, and they simply open fire. I forget if it's hundreds of people died that day, how many it was. I've been to the place myself. It's a fascinating memorial. But they simply mow down hundreds. The numbers I've heard, something like they use, 2,000 bullets and 1,970 hit a human target. In other words, they were not simply setting off flash bangs or firing a few rounds to get people to disperse. They were shooting to kill. And this, for many people, they argue that after this happened, British time was up. Let's look at this from a book called The Proudest Day about Indian independence. As a result of Jallianwala Bagh, what had been a desultory campaign by minority groups seeking home rule for within the British Empire was transformed virtually overnight into a vigorous, determined, and popular national independence movement. Britain's time in India was up. From that moment at Jallianwala Bagh, the only question was, how soon could the Indians get rid of their British rulers? Now, not every historian would necessarily agree. They might argue that this was important but lesser important. But a lot of people see this as a point where Indians become determined their independence. Again, this is from the park itself, the monument itself, and I was there as they explain what happened that day. And you see photographs people were fired at from this spot. This is a painting that's an absolutely enormous mural that dominates the a lot of very touching individual stories of people that were there that describe their husbands, their children, their mothers, etc., going down, and the bodies that had been pulled out of a well in which they've been shot and dumped. You go there, that is my pinky, my left pinky, as it looked many, many, many years ago. There are still the bullet holes in the wall, and it's almost irresistible to put this in. This is a well that people dove into. 120 dead bodies were removed. People that are just trying to escape from the gunfire leapt into this and were drowned and crushed beneath. It was a full-out massacre. So Gandhi himself, an interesting character, came from the Vaishya caste. Remember, there are the Brahmins at the top, and there are the Kshatriya, or warriors, or governors in between. The Shudra, who are the peasants, are the lowest caste, and then not even a caste are the Dalit, or untouchable. The Vaishya are that sort of middle class. They're storekeepers, they are professionals, they're not military, they're not religious. Very similar to in China and Japan. It's that potentially merchant class. Remember that it's not as simple in the Hindu world that there are 4 and only 4 castes and the untouchables. There are dozens and dozens and hundreds. I think they're called jata, which are subcastes and sub-subcastes. But he came from a pretty educated, fairly middle-class to wealthy family. Notice that he studied law in England, and that's unusual. One of the theories about why India never really drove its culture, its history, and its power outside of India was that desire to keep within caste. Certainly, by virtue of Mohandas Gandhi going off to England, he was coming in contact with people that were not a part of his caste, which traditional Hindus would have frowned upon. He studied law, got his degree, I forget if it's Oxford or Cambridge, it's one of them fancy places, and goes to South Africa, which had a huge, and still has a huge Indian population. There were a series of anti-Indian laws, past laws, discriminatory laws. Remember, South Africa by 1913 becomes an independent, white-run country. It is interesting with Gandhi, the simple look at him is a man who believed in equality for all, and that's probably too fair to Gandhi. Gandhi was pretty deeply racist, as of most people of his time. One of the things he was most upset about is that superior Indians were being treated like black Africans. So Gandhi is not a perfect figure by any means, but also very impressive in many other ways. He comes back to India in 1915, well known in India because of his leadership role in fighting the anti-Indian roles in South Africa, and he becomes really the dominant force in the Indian National Congress by World War I. Ooh, going to teach you some Hindi language right now. Swadeshi, only purchasing Indian-made goods. Basically, these are boycotts. Right? I mean, that's the idea behind this, is that we we don't want to buy the British-made goods. Remember, the British had forced the Indians to buy British-made cloth. It was illegal to set up a clothing factory in India. Remember how the British talked about free trade and no government involvement? Yeah, right. As long as the free trade is good for us, we're in favor of it. Otherwise, we'll put on whatever restrictions we want to because it's about Britain, not about the principles of free trade. So an attempt to boycott, refuse to purchase British-made goods. In fact, you see Gandhi symbolically sitting in front of a spinning wheel, weaving his own clothing. And it is said that Gandhi, even when he was a international leader, he still spent like a meditative time of each day spinning cloth to do it symbolically, also as a form of meditation. Hind Swaraj, Indian self-rule. Independence? Yeah, eventually independence, but self-rule or separation from English to a degree specifically. Hind, by the way, Hindustan is the name for India as well. So he's talking about not a Hindu self-rule, but an Indian self-rule. Satyagraha, non-violent, non-cooperation. This is what we associate with Gandhi, right? That Gandhi refused to follow the laws, but not to use violence. And this is something that he held with fairly firmly. He did not believe in cooperating and getting along at all. He was willing to put himself right at the front of the lines and invite violence upon him, but not to respond with violence. A hartal is a work stoppage. It's a general strike. If we Indians put down our tools and refuse to work, it'll devastate the British economy. And I believe it's called ahimsa. I think I've got that S and M backwards, but a general nonviolence, not just simply as a tactic, but as a moral principle. So these are nice words. Now, boy, you toss a couple of these in on an APSA, you're sitting pretty, you are. This is where Gandhi becomes an internationally known figure. Remember, we have movie cameras by this point. We have newsreels. No one's watching TV at home. It's not there yet, but before every film, you're seeing international newsreel footage of people from all parts of the world. And Gandhi was a smart guy. Gandhi understood publicity and propaganda. Remember, the British had a salt tax. Indians had to buy their salt from the British. Even Indians that lived along the coast were technically not allowed to gather salt water, let it evaporate, and use the salt. They were forced by law. I don't know how often it was enforced, but at least by law, they had to purchase their salt, which is terribly important for taste, for preserving food, from the British. So Gandhi says, you know what? I can turn this into a publicity event. He starts up on a 24-mile march, does about 10 miles a day, as you see, and he starts with only a handful of people, but by the time he gets to the sea, there are thousands of people with him. And, the film cameras are showing up, and the reporters are showing up, and what does he do? He goes to the water, collects the salt water, boils it, and starts using the salt. He is arrested for this, because that is illegal to do this. And people across India are inspired by Gandhi and they're outraged by these stupid, discriminatory, embarrassing laws. But even British people and others around the world, they're captivated by this. This little man in simple clothing. Wait, what did he get arrested for? He took salt from the ocean, but India's surrounded by sea. Wait a minute. Well, is this right? Is this legitimate for the British to run this way? China. Man, is this a photograph or what? Found this in a book that I bought many, many, many years ago. That is the bridge into Tibet. I just think that is a magnificent photograph, that raging water and different time for sure. That China, of course, had been really taken over by the West. The Opium Wars of the 1840s. Yeah, the Qing Empire is still there, but what you've really got is very little power. You've got the Qings, and by the way, I drew this. It's an excellent drawing. The Qing Empire nominally goes back to the 1640s, and there is an emperor on the throne. But you know what? You've also got the Western powers. China's been divided up into spheres of influence, so the British have control in some areas, the French in others, the Russian, the Japanese, etc. And then you've also got this young reforming nationalist group. And these are Chinese who are sick of the outsiders. Hey, the Qings, they're not even Chinese, and they're not serving us well. The Westerners, how humiliating to have Westerners control our economy and our legal system. So all three of these are balancing for power. And then because central power is broken out, you've got so-called warlords. You can call them feudal lords. You can call them wealthy landowners with their own private army that controls certain parts of China. This is what it looked like before 1911. I say 1911 because there is a major rebellion then, and the one that overthrows the Qing Empire. And in fact, there is no longer a dynasty system in China. You know what? This isn't new. The Taiping Rebellion we had mentioned. Wow, 15-year rebellion that covered much of the country. Some maybe 20 to 30 million people died. Recall in 1895, China is defeated in war by Japan. This leads to rebellions. There's the Boxer Rebellion that is both against the Qings and against the Westerners, and it takes Western military forces to put it down. Now, if you are a Chinese Confucian and you see that China has been taken over by outside powers, and there have been 3 major revolts in the past 50 or 60 years, what does that suggest to you about the Qing dynasty's time and power? It's coming to an end. They have clearly lost the mandate of heaven. Who will be taking over next? Well, the nationalists that you saw in that last graph at the bottom left of the triangle, they've been organizing a big rebellion. It was going to be a day in which they were going to attack major cities and cut off the telegraphs and et cetera, et cetera. Well, it was planned for October 16th, except word got out. And so I think it actually began, it began about a week earlier when suddenly a number of leaders had been arrested. It was clear that the British and the Qing officials had learned about this, and there was a point, look, everyone's got our names, they know who we are, let's go. So a rebellion begins. I don't know exactly where it began, but it spread pretty quickly. The Qings were so discredited. By the way, the last emperor, Pu Yi, the last Qing emperor, I think he was about 9 years old. It was actually his mother who was really in charge of things. It spreads throughout China. By early 1912, the last emperor, Pu Yi, abdicates. The Qing Empire is over. You know what? The Chinese imperial system is over. Sun Yat-sen becomes the leader. Interesting background. He knows it's different. He came from a poor peasant background. Well, how could he possibly get any power? He wasn't a wealthy landowner. Recall the Chinese system, which did allow people to start at the bottom as long as they could prove their merit, the Chinese exam system, etc. Either he or his family before him had converted to Christianity, which is very unusual and sometimes dangerous in China at this point. He had actually been educated in the Western ways. He was an English speaker. He had read some of the, Enlightenment documents. He had known about Western industrialism. He knew about the ideas of Karl Marx and of free market capitalism, etc. He had become an opponent, one of the nationalist opponents, and was forced to leave China and went over to California. At that point, he was writing, raising money, etc. And when the Qing government is overthrown in late 1911, 1912, Sun Yat-sen is called back and becomes the new leader of this modern Republic of China. Not the new emperor, a republic. What did Sun stand for? Well, he called it the Three People's Principles. Nationalism. China for the Chinese. Let's get rid of the foreigners. We can deal with the foreigners. We can interact, but on an equal basis. So the Westerners who have carved up parts of China economically, that'll stop. And needless to say, the outsider Qings that have dominated us, the Manchus for so long, have to go. A democracy, some kind of a constitutional republic. Everybody votes equally? Nah, probably not. Probably a limited franchise, as you'll see still in the United States and Europe. But the Japanese, and by the way, they are watching the Japanese. They've seen how powerful the Japanese have become. You know what? The Japanese caught on before we did that when people feel like more people feel like they have a part or a role in the government, they have a voice, it just makes them more a part of a unified society. And then the most vague of the three, the people's livelihood. China needs to develop economically, not just politically, not just political independence. And you know what? We need to have state involvement to build up the economy. Sun Yat-sen was not a communist or anything close to this, but some of the socialist ideas of a stronger government to dictate the economy, to distribute wealth, something in that category is what Sun Yat-sen was calling for. To be honest, China is so chaotic during the period of Sun's rule and the rest of his life that he's never really able to impose any of these things. But these are the basic types of idea, the Three People's Principles. You'll find when we get to Mao's time, the Chinese love to count. It's the 3 this, the 5 this, the 7 that. It just is. Yeah, within a few years, we have what they call the warlord period. This new Chinese republic, look, you already had these independent lords with their armies, etc. The Confucian system was abandoned by the new Chinese republic. The emperor was gone. The Europeans are still there benefiting, making a lot of money, but not that interested in keeping the country relatively at peace, particularly when there was this massive war in Europe at this point. So you start seeing that areas, the warlords, the people with their own militaries, are really kind of at constant war among themselves. And the big cities, there's an organization called the Green Gang. This is a mafia. This is organized crime that is also fighting for control. So you see China basically in anarchy and chaos during this period. As you'll see, I have a wonderful ability to do art once again, and you are seeing that China, although the Qings are gone, there's still a lot of division. The nationalists that used to be at war with the Qings and the Westerners, all right, now Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang Party, it's just the name of the political party, they're the leaders of the Chinese Republic, but they start to split between a more right-wing conservative and a left-wing communist forces, and you'll see how that plays out. The Westerners, they're still there. The Westerners are not willing to give up their economic and political power, but then you've also got the extra legal folks. You've got the warlords and the urban mafias that in some areas they simply control the country and the Westerners don't care and Sun Yat-sen's government just can't do anything about them. Some pretty violent, nasty photographs in this book, but the types of torture, people who are left to die this way, potential rebels. These are actual beheadings. This is what would happen done with a sword. This is real stuff. When Sun Yat-sen dies, a man named Chiang Kai-shek, spelled different ways, but this is the most common, at least I've seen, takes over and decides to declare war upon the communists. Remember that his political party, the Kuomintang, had been divided between the communists and the non-communists. He leads in 1926, called the Northern Expedition, basically goes out and crushes the warlords, takes the Chinese army built up with Western support, and is able to defeat all of these. He unifies, sort of modernizes China. He himself, however, very much a dictator. To say, oh, he's anti-warlord or anti-communist, then he must believe in democracy. Nonsense. He was a dictator and a pretty corrupt regime as well. He never has a lot of support of Chinese people. But you do have at least a nominally unified China. 26. Don't know if you would recognize either of these faces. Most of you would not know Chiang Kai-shek, that's Zhou Enlai, who is Mao's chief attendant. But this is Mao Zedong over on the right. And Mao is a name, well, certainly you'll be familiar with. Many of you may already know him or recognize his face. Interesting when you see these young men who become the older men of history. But yeah, it's kind of fascinating photograph. So Mao Zedong, he is a young communist leader. There's a major split in the Chinese leadership between the communist and non-communist. Communism begins to grow in the countryside in particular, because remember, there is a communist state at this point. We will cover this a little later in the class this year, but the Soviet Union becomes a communist state in 1917. Remember that the Soviet Union, Russia, had been a largely agricultural rural society. So Mao watches this and said, look, I've read Marx. However, I'm also seeing the Russian example. Well, Chiang Kai-shek decides that he needs to crack down on the communists and forces them to disappear into the countryside, trying to kill as many as he can. The communists use this time to work with people in the countryside and set up their own little independent areas. It's called the Long March, and as the Chinese communists are being chased out of the big cities and central areas of China, against all odds, they're able to escape in the countryside, survive for years. It's a 4,000-mile march, etc. It's a part of it's a myth to a degree. Certainly Chinese communists are persecuted and have to disappear. The idea that Mao is personally leading people out through the countryside to be able to impose their communist beliefs upon the people, it's a good story as much as anything. But truly it is. The Chinese Communist Party leadership is largely destroyed by Chiang Kai-shek, and they survive in the countryside. So it's called the Long March. You'll see the numbers here. Only about a third who leave actually manage to survive. Either they stay with the struggle or avoid being killed or captured along the way. But again, pretty important, because after World War II, when China enters into a civil war between communists and non-communists, there is something of this mythology of the Chinese communists rising up and being able to survive. And also, since China is mostly rural, the communists had a lot of friends and supporters in the rural areas after World War II. And there's a guy that even had it tattooed on his back because he thought it was so important. Finally, Japan. I'm actually going to go through this pretty quickly because we'll cover it separately as well. Remember that Japan is the exception, right? Japan is the country that had modernized. The Meiji Restoration, China had become a dominant industrial power by World War I and is actually a part of the Allied powers in World War I. This is a little bit of a lead-in. One of the problems that happens when the Great Depression hits in 1929 and countries kind of disappear into themselves and they don't want, they don't trade with other countries and they try to only make their own stuff to get people employed. This is a huge problem for Japan. Japan is a sophisticated, modern, technological, industrial society that has almost no resources. The Japanese don't have any coal. They don't have any oil resources. They can barely feed themselves. They build stuff. They're able to trade for stuff, but they're very limited in terms of what they can grow in a densely populated, fairly small, rocky area. So the Japanese in 1931, because they need land, they need resources, they invade Manchuria. Remember, that's where the Qing Empire came from. The Manchus came from. They take this over in 1931. Now, the British and the French and the English and the Americans are enraged by this. How can you do this? This is not your territory. Well, hey, Belgians, what are you doing in the Congo? Britain, what are you doing in India? Well, we're civilizing these people. Oh, okay, well, we're civilizing the Northern Chinese. No, you're not. Yeah, we are. Well, the League of Nations that was formed condemns Japan, says you can't do this. The Japanese just simply resign. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China, doesn't do much with this. Number one, he recognizes that the Chinese military can't fight against the Japanese. But number two, whatever weapons he is getting, he's using to attack the communists. Again, Japan's rise to power is 1868 is the Meiji Restoration. Remember, in 1895, they defeat China. The Russo-Japanese War. They take over Korea in 1910. They play a role with the Allied powers, but they still see this tremendous double standard. We are the economic and military equivalent of nearly every country on Earth, but we're not treated the same way. And yeah, it's a race thing. It's you're not European, you're not white. They were not treated as a legitimate power at Versailles. You might recall back in 1895, Japan defeats China and takes some things from China, and the Western powers step in and say, wait a minute, Japan, you can't do this. You can't take all those things the Chinese agreed to give you. Why? Well, it's going to upset the balance of power. But this has nothing to do with England, France, Belgium, Germany, the United States. Japan, we're telling you, you can't sign that peace treaty. So the Japanese see this tremendous double standard. They see Japanese people and the Japanese government as being treated like third-class citizens in the world, and they're right about this. Keep in mind the Japanese, if their emperor is a descendant of the sun god, Japan should be second to no one. In the 1920s, Japan continues to grow, but there are some problems. They're certainly not at the economic development of the United States or Germany had been and would be again after the war, etc. There are some problems in the 1920s, and that Great Depression is the big problem because Japan is cut off from international trade, and the Japanese simply don't have ability to get the resources they need to develop. The Emperor Hirohito, he's seen as a divine leader. Much like with the shogun, back when there had been a shogun in Japan, the emperor sits on the throne, he is representative of Japan, but there is another real leader, and it really is the military. The military itself takes a dominant role in Japan. The cabinet position, so who sits in the government and who are the top officials, the military has veto control. When the Prime Minister of Japan is assassinated in 1932, military leaders kind of take the place. So the democracy, or the Republic of Japan in the 1890s, 1910s, by the 1920s and early 30s, it is a military-run society. And a really great phrase to know for the AP is the zaibatsu. Zaibatsus are massive businesses, massive corporations controlled through families with just a few families controlling them. You see the numbers here. 1937, the four leading family-run corporations controlled directly one-third of the money in banks, one-third of Japan's trade, half of Japan's shipping industry, and pretty much all of the steel works of the major heavy industries. These are four families controlling, it appears, about half of Japan's economy. What you end up seeing is this partnership between the military and the industrialists. The zaibatsus and the military give each other what they need. And by the time World War II rolls around, Japan is really a society run by these few massive corporations and the military. By the 30s, again, we'll look at these numbers. We're going to look at this separately as we move into World War II. But Japan, size of California, very densely populated. Hideki Tojo becomes the prime minister, and he's sort of like the Hitler-Mussolini equivalent, signs Japan into a treaty with Italy and Germany. Yeah, I don't know why I had this twice. I'm a little bit disorganized on this. But again, the Chinese, the invasion of Manchuria in northern China, normally when we say World War II, it's, 1939 to 1945. But honestly, this is, if we're talking World War, this is it. Remember, the Japanese have a rationale. We need the resources. We've been mistreated by the other Western powers. We need to do this. We have a right to do it. Strictly speaking, the Japanese didn't take control. They took Puyi, the very last of the Manchu emperors, and they put him on the throne of this new state called Manchukuo. But of course, that was in name only. By the way, 6 years later, the Japanese invade the eastern part of China, some of the most just bloody and flat-out genocidal behavior that we see during a really ugly war. Yeah, so there's the invasion of etc. Little cartoon in class, we'd probably stop to look at these, but these are all the peace treaty and peacekeeping methods used after World War I, and you see symbolically the Japanese blowing holes in all of them by invading parts of China. And just to point out, it's not only these couple of places. This is a revolutionary period that really begins with the Atlantic revolutions of the 1780s and 90s, but you start seeing alternatives. You start seeing this period of Western dominance that you see in the age of imperialism. It's being challenged. Certainly, the Japanese are very inspiring to darker-skinned people around the world, and the Soviet Union themselves are seen as although a Western country that uses a new model. So you see a bunch of revolutions. You see an Iranian revolution that I don't know much about in 1905, the so-called Young Turks, including Kemal Ataturk, who 10 years later becomes the leader of Turkey. There's a Mexican revolution that we will or won't cover in this class, but it is huge and very, very impactful in Latin America. The Chinese Revolution of 1911, 1912. You see these revolutions against the British in Iraq and in Egypt as well. Turkey becomes a secular state. You see India and China, and you even see across Africa, you see some Africans trying to picture a world without the Europeans. So the 20th century is going to be a very, very different century. I believe this is the last slide. You got a couple of weeks to watch it, so I don't feel that terribly guilty about this. But take some notes, come up with some questions. We'll talk about it in class a little bit, and thank you for your attention.